Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Windsor. In this lecture, I will be talking about medication development, regulation, and resources. So after this lecture, you should have a better understanding of the terms and abbreviations associated with medication development, regulation, and resources. More specifically, you will be able to describe lawmakers' roles in the regulation of drugs, discuss the purpose of the Joint Commission and the role that it plays in drug regulation, as well as describe medication development and testing, the role of the FDA, and pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. In addition to all of those things, you should come away with a better understanding of medication labeling regarding the brand, generic, and chemical names, as well as list and describe the information found on the medication labels. Lastly, we will learn more about the various pharmacology resources. The first part of this chapter discusses the regulation of medication, and believe it or not, medications have not always been regulated. So stay tuned for a timeline of the progression of regulation. But first, let's talk about the World Health Organization, or the WHO. The job of the WHO is to act as a coordinating authority on international health, combat disease, and promote the overall health of people. The WHO also publishes the annual World Health Report and guidelines for safe surgery. Now, the World Health Report contains information to help countries make policies and funding decisions. The guidelines for safe surgery, which includes information on topics such as antibiotic prophylaxis, adverse drug reactions and their prevention and treatment, causes of medication errors in the perioperative setting, management of blood loss, and delivery of anesthesia. They also have developed a surgical safety checklist that facilities can use, and there's a good example of this in our textbook on page 53 in figure 4.5. It's important to note that the WHO is an agency of the United Nations that's responsible for the international regulation of medications, but it doesn't enforce laws concerning drugs. This is different from country to country. So some countries have very strict laws and others are not as strict. And because of this, medications are often available in some countries prior to others. So now we should have a better understanding of how drugs are regulated on the international level. Next, we're going to take a look at drug regulation from a federal and state perspective. It's important to note that federal and state agencies impact surgical technology in different ways. Federal laws are designed to protect consumers from harmful, impure, unsafe, and untested medications through the regulation of the pharmaceutical industry. State governments develop practices and practice acts that govern the ordering, dispensing, administration of medication. As such, these laws can vary greatly from state to state. So a good example of this is the variation of marijuana legalization status from state to state. So here I've created a timeline regarding the establishment of federal laws associated with the regulation of medication. And like I said, drugs were not always regulated. For example, did you know that the original recipe for Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine? Coca-Cola was invented in 1885 by John Pemberton. And Pemberton was a pharmacist from Atlanta, Georgia, who concocted the original formula in his backyard. Initially, like I said, his recipe contained cocaine in the form of an extract of the coca leaf, which inspired the coca part of the beverage's name. The cola part comes from the cola nut, which contains caffeine, which is yet another stimulant. And interestingly, when Coca-Cola was invented, cocaine was legal and a common ingredient in medications. So people thought it was safe to use in small amounts. Then things started to change in the 1900s. This is when the federal government stepped in to regulate the dispensing and administration of medications to protect consumers. Then, in 1906, the federal government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, this act set standards for quality and required the proper labeling of medications. Then, in 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed. And now this act required animal testing of medications. And not only did pharmaceutical companies now have to apply for approval of a drug, they had to prove that it was safe to use on animals first. Then in 1952, the Durham-Humphrey amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act were passed. These amendments differentiated between those drugs that were prescription drugs and required a written prescription and those that could be sold over the counter. In 1970, the federal government passed the Controlled Substance Act, and as its name suggests, this act designated certain medications as controlled substances. We'll take a look at these in more detail in a bit. However, you can find them listed in Table 2.1 in your textbook. So that brings us to 1973. In 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA, was established to enforce the Controlled Substance Act. Now, it sets standards for handling controlled substances and has the authority to enforce those standards. Lastly, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, you might have heard it called OSHA, was established in 1991. Now, OSHA ensures that you and I are kept safe on the job by setting and enforcing standards. In 1991, OSHA published the Occupational Exposure to Bloodborne Pathogens standard, and this is especially important to us because it provides guidance for post-exposure protocols. OSHA published a protocol for emergency needle stick information in 1995, and they also collaborate with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. So in this emergency needle stick information publication, they recommend post-exposure prophylaxis, and we abbreviate that as PEP. What this means for us is that if we have a needle stick or a sharps injury, what we need to do is immediately report it and start post-exposure prophylaxis. So you want to be sure that you know what your policies are in your surgical technology program, but also when you are on site at your facility. So as I mentioned previously, the Controlled Substance Act was passed in 1970, and it established schedules of drugs with abuse potential. So there are 5 schedules, and again, you can see them in Table 2.1 in your textbook. The first schedule of controlled substances is C1. Now, these drugs are not approved for medical use, and they are labeled as having the highest abuse potential, and they include drugs like LSD, heroin, PCP, and marijuana. Now, you may be curious why marijuana is on this list. Remember, marijuana is approved for use at a state level only, and we're going to take a look at state practices in a little bit, but it's not approved for use by the federal government. The second schedule of controlled substances is C2. These drugs have a high potential for abuse, but they are approved for medical use. And some examples you can see here are alfentanil, opium, cocaine, codeine, and morphine. C3, C4, and C5 drugs are medically accepted for use. However, C3 drugs have a moderate abuse potential. Some examples of C3 drugs include steroids and products with low amounts of codeine. C4 and C5 drugs have a very low potential for abuse, and many C5 drugs are available over the counter. So now that we have a better understanding of federal laws and agencies, I want to talk a bit about the regulation of medications at a state level. So this completes the discussion of federal medication regulation, but what about the states? State practice acts govern medication ordering, dispensing, and administration. And as I mentioned, these laws can vary from state to state. These laws regulate who can prescribe drugs, regulate pharmacy practices, and whether or not pharmacies can substitute a generic medication for a prescribed medication. It's also important to note that state governments must comply with federal regulations. So if there is an instance where they differ, then the more stringent law is going to apply. In Arizona, primarily doctors, nurse practitioners, and physician's assistants can prescribe medications. Under state practice acts, physicians may prescribe drugs, but they can also delegate that power to other parties. However, this delegatory power isn't unlimited, and it is controlled by the medical licensing boards. Surgical technologists act as physician extenders. We're the physician's extra hands. We receive, handle, prepare, pass, and track the amount of medications used. As STs, it's important that we know our state's unique practice acts because state practice acts vary. Like I said, the legal standards of medication administration for the surgical technologist may also vary. If state laws don't specifically address the role of the surgical technologist, then we should refer to the surgical technologist scope of practice. And you can find a good example of that on the AST website. It's also important to note that if local policies are ever outdated, we want to stay within their limits until they're revised. And these policies may also vary from facility to facility. So be sure you know the policies of your facility too. The Joint Commission. Now, the Joint Commission is an organization that regulates and credits more than 20,000 healthcare organizations and programs in the country. And we abbreviate that TJC. Now, the Joint Commission is the premier standard setting and accreditation force for healthcare agencies. This is similar to attending a surgical technology program that's accredited compared to one that is not. Accredited programs meet a predetermined set of standards, and they're held to those standards by the accrediting body. Annually, the Joint Commission publishes something called the National Patient Safety Goals, and these goals address issues such as infection control and universal protocol and preventing wrong site, wrong procedure, wrong person surgery, as well as how to prevent medical errors. Now, the Joint Commission published the implementation guide on surgical site infections in 2013. It also published the Do Not Use list, which can be seen in Table 2.2 in your textbook. The Institute for Safe Medication Practices also publishes a list of error-prone abbreviations, symbols, and dosages. So these two documents pertain to any handwritten, patient-specific documentation, computer and pre-printed forms, and warn against the use of dangerous abbreviations, acronyms, and symbols. Now we should have a better understanding of state practices and the Joint Commission. Next, we're going to learn more about drug development. As I mentioned previously, the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, oversees the medication development process to ensure basic safety and effectiveness standards. This process takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money, and it's the reason why our medications are so expensive. According to the text, drug development can take up to 15 years and cost as much as $8 million. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the CDER, ensures that basic standards in the pharmaceutical industry are being followed. Now, these regulations apply to prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, biological therapeutics, and generic drugs as well. The CDER also evaluates all new drugs before they are sold. In addition to that, they are the ones that review TV, radio, and printed drug advertisements for accuracy, and they also provide health professionals with information for consumers. It's important to note that the FDA inspects facilities in the United States and overseas where drugs are made for our country. They also review new drug applications. They investigate and remove unsafe drugs from the market, and they require proper labeling for each drug. Interestingly, 80% of our medications do not even come from our country. They come from countries like India and China. Now that we know a bit more about drug development, let's learn more about the US FDA pregnancy categories. This classification system rates the medication effects on newborn fetuses. So take a look in your book at Table 2.3. Here you're going to see the U.S. Food and Drug Administration pregnancy categories. And as you can see, there are 5 categories, and those are A, B, C, D, and X. Category A drugs do not pose a risk to the fetus. Now, Category B drugs have been tested on animals, but not on humans, but they've been proven safe on animals, unborn animals. So it's assumed that there is little to no risk in humans because there was no documented risk to the animal fetus. Category C drugs were identified as causing risks to animal fetus, and therefore it's assumed that they would harm the unborn human child. When patients that are pregnant need these medications, the healthcare provider is going to ask themselves if the benefits of giving the drug outweighs the risks. Category D, kind of similar. They have been proven to harm the unborn human fetus. Again, the healthcare provider is going to ask, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And then lastly, Category X drugs have been proven to have a harmful effect on the unborn human fetus. Class X drugs should not be given during pregnancy because the risks of giving the drug far outweigh the benefits of the drug. The FDA's pregnancy categories are useful for surgical medications in some medical situations. Remember, cholecystitis and appendicitis are two of the most common reasons we would operate on a pregnant patient. So because of that, these categories serve as a guide perioperatively. So I bet you're all wondering, what does it take to develop a new drug? That's what we're going to learn about next. In terms of drug testing, the FDA has devised a very stringent system for achieving approval. The system is so stringent that only 5 of the more than 5,000 drugs that enter preclinical testing progress to testing on humans. The drug development process begins with animal testing. 2 species of mammals, male and female, are tested, and during this phase, researchers look for signs of toxic effects as well as determine the safe dosage levels. So once the medication is proven safe in animals, drug testing moves to humans. So during the first phase of human testing, which is also referred to as the exploratory phase, a small sample group, about 10 to 15 people, are given a very, very low dose of the drug to help determine safety and efficacy. And as a result, researchers make the determination regarding the drugs to move forward with into phase 1. During the next phase, called the clinical pharmacology phase, typically 20 to 80 healthy male volunteers who suffer from the problem that the drug is supposed to treat are given the medication. In the clinical investigation phase, the medication is given to several hundred people, and this is going to help establish effectiveness and optimum dosages. And this can take up to 3 years' time. The drug is safe to move on to the clinical trial phase if no serious side effects, were noted in phase 2. In this phase, hundreds or thousands of patients are given the drug, and during this time, researchers are continuing to note the effectiveness, safety, and or side effects that are associated with the drug, and this can take several years' time to complete this phase. If the drug moves to the next phase, let's go back to the clinical investigation phase for just 1 second. During the clinical investigation phase, researchers may conduct something that is called a double-blind study. And a double-blind study is where half of the test groups of patients is given the actual drug and the other half is given a placebo, which is typically like a water pill. It's the fake drug, but nobody in the study knows if they're getting the real drug or the fake drug, and scientists and researchers continue to evaluate those patients accordingly. So now let's move on to the clinical trial phase. If we get past the clinical investigation phase, then we get to the clinical trial phase. The last phase is the post-marketing study, and that the final phase concludes testing with post-marketing studies, and this is where drug companies continue to monitor the medication through results gathered from prescribing physicians, and the time varies there as well. So it's important to note that all data gathered are going to be reported to the FDA, and then voila, right? We have a new drug. 2 terms we need to be familiar with are pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. Can you tell that these 2 terms are a combination of pharmaceuticals and genetics? Pharmacogenetics is the study of genetic factors in predicting a medication's action and how it could vary from its intended response. due to those genetic factors. Now, pharmacogenomics refers to the study of the genes that determine medication behavior. Pharmacogenomics is nearly identical to pharmacogenetics, and for that reason, these two terms are used interchangeably with one another. So pharmacogenetics is a significant technological advancement in medicine because people have different genetic makeups, and because of that, could be an additional factor as to why they respond differently to medications and therapies. Continuing on with pharmacogenomics, this technology offers some distinct advantages for medication development. Because scientists can create pharmacogenetic maps and catalog these genetic variations, then pharmaceutical companies can use the information to create medications that are effective despite mutations that may render them ineffective. This can also help facilitate new medication discovery, the development of drug markers that help target specific diseases, the ability to revisit medications that have failed approval in the past, and even facilitate the medication approval process. Pharmacogenomics can also reduce the cost and risk of clinical trials for these medications, so that's awesome. However, there are also some distinct disadvantages to pharmacogenomics. One disadvantage is that genetic research is complex and it's really expensive. Also, training professionals in the field regarding pharmacogenomics can be somewhat of a challenge. If you want to know more about pharmacogenomics, then you can take a peek at the National Institute of Health's website and put it up there on the screen for you. So during the development of the drug, the company is going to assign the new drug a generic name. We'll also use this generic name throughout the development process. Then later, it's going to select a trade name, and this is the name that it's going to use when it markets the drug. The brand names of the medications are often the well-known names. The U.S. Pharmacopedia and National Formulary, which is abbreviated USPNF, they're the organization that's responsible for assigning the official name to the medication, and that is what we refer to as the generic name, all right? So the company picks the trade name, and then the USPNF is going to pick the generic name. So for example, I have up here for you, Flonase. Right? That's the brand name, Flonase. It also has a generic name, which you can see in the second picture, which is fluticasone. Once the medication is approved for release, it has exclusive rights to market the drug under their trade name for 20 years. And that's referred to as a patent. And a patent is usually issued before the clinical trial begins. So by the time the drug gets approved, there's usually 7 to 12 years left that it can market the drug under the trade name. Now, after that, when the patent is expired, other companies can start to market a generic equivalent with a different trade name. So we're going to spend some time, the majority of the remainder of this lecture, talking about medication labels. Did you know that a drug has 3 different names? We already talked about 2 of them, the brand name and the generic name, but it also has a chemical name. So first, let's talk about the brand and the generic name. Now, a medication's brand, which is sometimes referred to as the proprietary name, often appears in large, bold text, and it's placed prominently on the medication label. You can see some over-the-counter medication examples on the left of the image here. It's important to note that a brand name is always capitalized and it's always followed by the trademark sign. So on the left here, you can see Advil, Band-Aids, Pepto, Visine, so on and so forth. Those would be the brand names or the proprietary names. In addition to the brand name, the drug is also going to have a generic name, which is non-proprietary. And the generic name seen in the right side of this image isn't owned by a company, so it's typically not capitalized. And you can see here, the non-proprietary name looks to be called Exact. Exact. You can see it up in the top corners. It's not making a debut big on the label. It's not capitalized. So if you're ever unsure or confused about a medication label, please do not hesitate to ask someone, because this can help you to avoid any medication errors. The third name that a drug has is its chemical name, and this is usually a really long word that's really hard to pronounce. Here you are looking at the chemical name for the drug ecstasy. Now, the chemical name of a medication precisely describes its chemical composition and its molecular structure. And medication labels do not usually include the chemical name of the medication on the label. Items that appear on the medication label include, there's a ton of information on there. You're going to find the brand name, generic name, manufacturer's name, dosage strength, form, supply dose, and volume at a minimum. There's some other things that we're going to talk about too. The dosage strength. Let's talk about that. So I already talked about the brand name, the generic name, the manufacturer's name. The dosage strength is the amount of the medication in a specific unit of measure. So take a look at this lidocaine label on the slide. Do you know what the strength of the lidocaine is? It's 1%, right? It's 1%. Remember from chapter 1 that we said there are 4 forms of drugs, 4 drug forms. Do you remember what those forms are? They are solid, semi-solid, liquid, and gas. So that's going to be on the label as well. Supply dosage is the concentration. So typically this is read as X measured units per quantity. So lidocaine, 1%. What does that mean? That means it is 1 gram of medication per 100 mLs of solution or solute, right? 1 gram of, solute to 100 milliliters of solvent. That's what that means. So what is the total volume in the bottle of lidocaine? Can you see it up there in the top left corner? I circled it for you. It's 20 milliliters in this bottle of lidocaine. There are also some examples of labels in chapter 2 of the textbook for supply, dosage, and total volume, so be sure to take a peek at those. Something else that you'll find on the label could be a label alert or a manufacturer warning, such as refrigerate or shake well before use. This one is hard to read here on the lidocaine, but it says on there a little warning that says not for epidural or caudal use. You might also find this in the instructions that comes in the box with the bottle and not necessarily on the label. All medications, we should use them, discard them, or return them to the pharmacy by the expiration date. So the expiration date is something that we always want to check before we use the medication. And it's usually indicated with EXP period, short for expiration. And then it's going to be followed by the month and the year. Because it does not have a day, we are to assume that the drug is good until the last day of the month. As surge checks, like I said, it's really important for us to understand and check all medication labels so that we're using the right thing for our patient. Some other tidbits of information that we might find on the drug label. Remember, we discussed administration routes in chapter 1, and here, put this little picture here for you of heparin label, and it indicates that the route of administration is injection. Labels also have, like I said, alerts and expiration dates. They also have something called a lot number. Some also have barcodes to assist with the tracking and the record keeping. Federal law also requires that every prescription medication has an identifying number, and this number always begins with the 3 letters NDC, and that stands for National Drug Code, and it's going to appear on the medication label. And again, if you look in your textbook, you can see some examples of the lot numbers, barcodes, and NDC numbers. So once a drug is approved, it must be published in information resources, such as the list of medication references that you see here. The physician's desk reference, we also call that the PDR, is one of the most frequently used resources, providing information on thousands of medications. And the PDR is updated annually. The information in the PDR is the same as that provided in the manufacturer's package insert. And like I said, there are approximately 3,000 medications listed in there. Information regarding the drug is going to include the brand and generic names, precautions, drug interactions, dosages, side effects, safety info, pregnancy ratings, poison, antidotes, and dietary supplements. Next is the United States Pharmacopedia and National Formulary. We talked about that before. The USPNF is popular among drug companies and pharmacists, and it's the official medication list that's recognized by the United States government. It is also updated on an annual basis. The AHFS, which is the American Hospital Formulary Service, is one reference that's considered unbiased because pharmaceutical companies are not the sole source of information that's included in there. And this reference is updated more frequently than the other 2 previously mentioned references. I think it's quarterly or something. The medical letter is a nonprofit publication that is published bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks, and this letter covers the treatment of various diseases. Now, the Facts and Comparisons publication includes a bunch of comparison charts and tables for thousands of prescriptions and also over-the-counter medications. There's also conventional publications that are not there are also unconventional publications that we use to get information on medications, and those can consist of computerized databases and the internet. We Google everything now, right? So there are electronic databases such as Micromedex and Clinisphere, and the internet is also going to give us, like I said, a lot of information as well. However, We should not trust every single thing we read on the internet because anybody can put anything that they want on the internet. So if you're going to go to the internet as a source of information, I suggest that you verify it from at least 2 different sources. So that's going to wrap it up for our discussion regarding medication development, regulation, and resources. Thank you so much for your time and for listening to this lecture. I'll see you next time when we dive into pharmacology mathematics. Thanks, guys. Take care.